Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I think we've got most people in now, which is great. I'm Miles. I'm the head of marketing here at Creative Mental Network, and thank you for joining Mind the Class Gap with us, learning about the value of socioeconomic diversity in creative workplaces. I'll just run over a few little housekeeping rules before we get started. So if you can keep yourself on mute, please, that would be fantastic. We are going to be recording the session. It will be shared along with the slides tomorrow. And if you have any questions throughout it, post them all into the chat, and then at the end of the Q&A, I'll be able to go through them with Natasha and Paula. And on that, let me introduce to you Natasha and Paula. Natasha is our Acting Managing Director at Creative Mental Network, and Paula from the Social Mobility Commission is the Head of Stakeholder Engagement. I'll pass over to them to get started.
Amazing, thanks, Miles. And firstly, thank you all so much for being here today. I can still see a few people coming in from the waiting room, but to have this amount of people at a session, which is middle of the week, is super impressive. And I think already that's really setting the tone for us in terms of that, people are recognizing that socioeconomic diversity is a really, really, really important topic. And hopefully today you will leave this session with some kind of clearer insights and understanding as to what it is, what it means, and what you can do. I recognize a few names in here already. So to all of those who we've worked with before, our current partners, our previous partners, welcome. But for those of you who are very much new to Creative Mental Network and the work that we do, my name is Natasha. I'm the Acting Managing Director, and in short, we are a charity that exists to make the creative industries more socio and economically diverse and inclusive. Essentially, we're trying to improve class representation, and the way that we do that is primarily through mentoring programs. So that's me. That's what we've been doing. We've been running for 10 years, but we're also joined today by the incredible Paula. So Paula, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tash, and thanks for the invite and warm welcome as well, Miles. So I am Paula Kemp. I'm Head of Stakeholder Engagement, and I look after our stakeholders around skills and employment. And I have worked for the Social Mobility Commission for around 3 years. And in that time, we've developed resources that support employers. And in particular, we worked very closely with membership bodies and employers within the creative industries as well to build some resources. So we'll be sharing those resources with you afterwards. The Social Mobility Commission exists to help create a country where your background doesn't dictate your future, really, and the outcomes for you there. And we look at things like parental education, employment, all the way through the someone's lifestyle, life choices, etc., to work out in terms of how we can support and best guide employers, businesses, government, policymakers, charities, how we can improve social mobility within the UK. So I'll hand back to you, Tash.
Thanks so much, Paula. So today, just see if I can get my screen sharing to work. So I'm conscious that some of you today will kind of be super active already in the sphere of kind of socioeconomic diversity, have a really thorough understanding of what it is, and maybe your organisations that you're working at are already implementing policies and initiatives to help improve it. For some of you, this may actually be your kind of first foray into understanding what it is. And either of those sides that you're on, hopefully the session will still be super beneficial for you, because we're going to kind of start off just with a kind of core understanding to bring us all together and actually just try and pinpoint what does socioeconomic background mean. We're going to kind of look at things around the importance of collecting it, how to collect it, also then the kind of fundamental value of socioeconomic diversity and how that can benefit you and your organisations that you're working at. And then we'll culminate this session at the end with what I'm sure you're all here for, is the kind of like clear, actionable, tangible steps that you can take away and you can start implementing on a kind of individual level and scaling up there to more kind of business-wide and organisational. So yes, as Mar said, we are recording this session. There's quite a lot. Me and Paula did a run through on this, and we were like, really, are we going to get through in time? But hopefully we're going to be pacey. But if there is anything that you do miss, as Mar said, we will share this recording and also the slides with you tomorrow or later on this week. So let's get stuck straight into, I guess, why we are all here and give us that kind of shared core knowledge and understanding. Miles, I think we may have lost our presentation. That's all good. We'll go with this. So yeah, we're going to first talk about defining what socioeconomic background means. And this is something that as a charity and us as a team here at Creative Mentor Network have spoken about a lot, because it's, you know, socioeconomic background and socioeconomic diversity. When you are talking about it, you are kind of inadvertently talking about class, and class is a really kind of complex, it's a nuanced topic, and as such, it's not something that's just static and really easy to define. And so hence why we've kind of taken a lot of time at Creative Mentor Network to actually just kind of figure out what does it mean, so that when we're working with our mentors and our partners, you know, in the creative industries, we can kind of all have that shared kind of joint knowledge and know that we're working towards the same thing. So for us at Creative Mentor Network, this is our definition, and this is how we refer to socioeconomic background. And we essentially refer to it as meaning a set of social and economic circumstances that someone has come from. When we're thinking about social, we're kind of referring there to things such as schooling, networks, and kind of by proxy cultural experiences. And when we're thinking about economics, we're talking about money, income, and also kind of by proxy occupation. And when we're working with those who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, what we can kind of relatively say there is that they are a group of people who have relatively less access to those things, so the kind of schooling, the networks and finance and income. But as I said, it is a really complex and nuanced topic, and I think different organisations that you will speak to will kind of refer to it slightly different ways. So Paula, I'd love to just ask you now, how do you talk about socioeconomic background and class at the Social Mobility Commission?
Thanks, Tash. Well, interestingly, social mobility in itself is moving from one class to another. But we feel that that's quite binary within the Social Mobility Commission, and there has been a narrative in the past thinking about moving from working class backgrounds into what we would consider professional class backgrounds. So moving from the what would be considered the lower bands to the higher. And whilst that's an amazing opportunity for some people, improving their life chances, like I mentioned at the beginning, might just mean, you know, that you know, they're a family of intergenerational unemployment, and they have succeeded in, you know, getting a job and being secure in that job and receiving a good income for them and their family. So we tend to talk about it in terms of the broader sense, that, you know, it's that step up from your parental background. And for us, you know, our definitions are working class, especially for the employers, it's working class, intermediate class, and professional class. We have in our past State of the Nation started talking about lower working class and higher professional class, so that we've made it that 5 distinct characterizations. But that's partly because we recognise that, you know, the bottom 20% of people within that categorization really do face some severe barriers. And we want to kind of really work to support those in terms of having better outcomes in life. I would say to organisations, talk to your people in terms of what they want, you know, what they want to be called and how the classification. Some people want to call it class, some people want to talk about it from a socioeconomic background. So it is really you know, and we'll talk about this later on, and it is really about understanding how other people want to be identified, and really working with that as well.
That's a really good point, Paula. As I said, like it, you know, because it is so complex and class is so tied up in kind of identity, it is quite nuanced. So I think there's definitely value in having a conversation with your organisation and with your employees and kind of finding out feedback in terms of terminology and phrases which works for you. So thanks, Paula. We're having a few little tech issues with our slides, so apologies that they're a bit further ahead, but I'm giving you a clue as to what we're going to be talking about now. And that is how we measure socioeconomic background. So we've kind of discussed there what it means. It's the kind of set of social and economic circumstances that you come from. But it can be a bit blurry because it is linked to identity, and which is why here at Creative Mentor Network, when we refer to our mentees, those that we work with, those who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, we use socioeconomic background versus working class, because, you know, for us there and kind of research that there are really clear ways to measure someone's socioeconomic background. And Paula, can you tell us a little bit around what the guidance is from the Social Mobility Commission as to how you measure someone's socioeconomic background to determine if they are from, say, lower socioeconomic background, middle, or so forth?
Absolutely, yes. So the guide, we'll share with you the responses to these, but this is based on your parents' occupation. So it's something that was set up by the Office of National Statistics many years ago, and it's used by academics and sociologists and economics, and that's the whole sort of socioeconomic piece of it. And parental occupation, when you're aged about 14, is the key understanding for social mobility. There are other questions that we'll talk about in a bit, but this one is the one that really does reflect, and partly it's to do with what Tash had said previously in terms of it's your social cultural capital. So some of the answers that are in, might be considered professional class. You might have a nurse in there, and obviously we know nurses' incomes aren't as high as maybe a CEO who is also in that grouping, but the access to cultural capital that nurse has in terms of the people they work with, but also the fact most nurses have degrees as well. So their cultural capital is a lot higher possibly than someone from a manual working class background. And that's why we use that. The reason it's about 14, this is quite interesting in terms of it's partly just historically has been, but when the ONS were first setting this, it was deemed that the middle child, when they were aged about 14, their parent, the main household earner, which was predominantly the male, and obviously we know traditions have changed and structures in society are very different now. But the parents would be settled in their occupation. They would be aged around 40, and whilst they might change jobs, they are very unlikely to change occupations. Now we know that might be very different these days, and so it is something we are looking at. But it is a key indicator, in terms of movement for social mobility. So that's why we use that one.
Oh, thanks, Paula. And I think, from the conversation that we've had, we carry out mental focus groups. We work really closely with our kind of HR leads and partners. There is still very much a kind of education piece, I think, that needs to be needed around this question, because there is a lot of pushback. And I feel that people, when, you're asked about what your parent or your carer's occupation was, there's almost an element of people feeling a bit defensive, why does that matter? That's irrelevant to the job that I'm applying for now. And I think that we need to break down that barrier and that stigma around this question. It's not at all to say that that's going to be used against you or anything like that. It's just there is lots of academic research which shows that parental occupation and by proxy income has a real influence, one of the most significant influences on your life outcomes. So we're just trying to look at that and figure out, well, are you actually someone who is from a low socioeconomic background and not in relation to your talent or your skill or anything you've currently got now. So I don't know about you, Paula, but that's something that I think we hear a lot in our conversations, is the kind of, why is this relevant? It doesn't matter.
We do, yes. I mean, and I think if you're starting to collect this data for incoming people, so coming into your organisation, there's often an opportunity that people will, they'll complete it for you. But if you're asking existing employees, it's a bit like, I've been in this career now for 15, 20, 30, 40 years. Why does it matter what my parents did? But it absolutely, as you say, has an impact on various aspects of your lives and pathways that you may have chosen through your lives. So it does have an influence.
And also, so that is the main question. That is the guidance from the Social Mobility Commission, which I think is from the ONS, right, Paula? I think that's where it comes from. But there are other questions that you can ask staff and employees that kind of builds a kind of slightly more detailed picture around your socioeconomic background, which, if my slides are painful, here we go. We've got a few of them on the screen here. So us personally at Creative Mentor Network, when we are looking at the eligibility of the young people that we work with, our main question is based on that parental or kind of primary earners occupation. But we do supplement it with a few other questions, as I said, to build that picture. And one of them is looking at type of schooling. So whether they attended a state school versus kind of independent or private. We look at eligibility for free school meals. And we also ask questions around kind of parental or carers education. And I think, Paula, it'd be really great if you could just give us a little bit of insight as to why those questions are asked, again, to kind of break down this stigma as to, maybe people feeling slightly maybe defensive about being asked them, and just what it helps us to see.
Absolutely. So these used to be the previous guidance, sort of pre-2020, was to ask all of these of everybody. But actually, what most of these questions do show you one end of the scale or the other. So in terms of the type of school you may have attended, that shows extreme privilege. Around 7% of people are privately educated in the UK. And yet within leadership in some organisations, that would be a lot higher in terms of those backgrounds. And so therefore they have had the same cultural and educational experiences as each other, but maybe don't have that same experience as the majority of their workforce or the majority of the workforce. And I think you've got some statistics, Natasha, in terms of what that looks like in the creative industries.
Yeah, exactly. So I think if we're looking in journalism and media, about 43% of those in kind of senior positions within journalism were privately educated. And as you said, we're comparing that to only 7% of the UK population as a whole. By looking at that data, you're recognising actually, is this group representative of the UK population? Probably not. And that's, we'll get onto this later on in the session, but then thinking about when you have that data and you have your insight, what are the things that you can follow up with and can do to implement and change? So yeah, the schooling thing, I found that a really thing. I remember when I first joined this role, Paula, I was really surprised at actually it's 93% of the UK population went to state school. It's the overwhelming vast majority. So it's showing if they're not, it's thinking about then, is there extreme advantage in this and privilege and do we need to assess our organisation and see if it's heavily skewed on that side?
Absolutely. We did some research at the SMC. It was back in 2019, and it's being updated by the Sutton Trust. So we partnered with the Sutton Trust, and they're re-looking at it. And it looked at things from judges right the way to, it was called Elitist Britain. So it was judges, media, senior leaders within business, etc. And it was heavily skewed towards those who'd been from privately educated. So it was quite an interesting thing. So we can share that resource afterwards. The other thing in terms of from the other side of the scale is looking at extreme disadvantage, is looking at people who were eligible for free school meals when in their secondary education, really. Around 15% of children are eligible for free school meals. That has probably, statistic has probably gone up somewhat now through COVID and also the expansion of some free school meal programmes within various boroughs. But that shows an extreme economic disadvantage. And we usually advise people to think about this when you're looking at outreach programmes to get people interested in your organisation or even in the industry, but also when you're looking at your colleagues who are coming in for younger talent programmes like apprenticeships or traineeships or graduate degrees. So that's quite a good measure in terms of looking for people from your early years talent programmes.
Thanks, Paula. Have we discussed parental carer education there? I think that's slightly, I'll let you elaborate on that one, Paula, but in terms of, I think, linked to more like graduate programs and things like that, right?
Exactly. So from the other thing that we say in terms of, and this used to be, you quite often hear people say, I was the first in family to go to university, and I too was the first in family to go to university. But there was very interesting research done in 2020 that showed that 68% of 25-year-olds graduating from university were actually first in family going to university. So that's a majority figure rather than a minority figure. So what it doesn't show you anything in terms of necessarily from a socioeconomic background, but what it does show you is you've got a vast amount of young people who are possibly entering into the workplace and graduate placements who don't have someone in their household who's already experienced that graduate program. And so you might want to look at additional support for that and for those individuals.
I said I wasn't going to do this, Paula, because I said looking at the chat sometimes distracts me, but Sanjina has just actually posted in a really interesting comment. I think it's worth probably just touching on at this point. And they're interesting, lots of companies do a modern version of free school meals and of free breakfast and lunch. And I think it's really important that using free school meals in isolation isn't a measure, because as you said, I mean, I know in lots of boroughs in London, all primary school young children now qualify for free school meals. So there are different policies that are kind of changing this, the kind of us being able to say that this is definitely tangibly as an impact of being from a lower socioeconomic background. But when used in coupling with looking at the kind of parental occupation, if that's from a lower socioeconomic background and eligibility for free school meals, it can then help you to determine, as you said, a group within your group that suffers even more, I guess, you know, disadvantage or economic disadvantage at this point. So yeah, always having, I guess, some kind of critical scrutiny with these when you're using them, making sure that they are being used alongside other measures.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That. All right, we will move on to our next section, which is all around why we should collect socioeconomic data. So it isn't currently a protected characteristic. And again, this is a conversation that we have in our team daily and weekly about, you know, why this isn't and when it will be and so forth. But as a result, because socioeconomic background isn't a protected characteristic currently, data isn't collected on it in the same way that it is with other kind of diversity data, such as gender, ethnicity, and sexuality. But although I know we spoke about this a lot when we were doing our kind of run-throughs, but I mean, there's a agreed thing between us that collecting it is super important and super valuable. So I guess to you, Paula, why should companies and organisations be collecting socioeconomic background data?
Well, one of the things I always respond when someone says, why should I do it? I was like, why wouldn't you? So, you know, so many organisations say that they don't think they have an issue in their organisation. But if you've not measured it, how do you know for sure? All the research that's been done out there in various industries shows there is a problem in terms of getting in and also in terms of progressing within those organisations. And so therefore, if you're starting to put into interventions, and there'll be interventions that are similar for any of the diversity programs or diversity protected characteristics, you know, you might be looking at a sort of a wine and talent apprenticeship scheme and really looking at broadening that. So why wouldn't you then include socioeconomic background to think then about how wide is it? You know, if you've got you think you've got a very diverse leadership group, because the other protected characteristics, there's representation. But if they all come from the same professional background, as we've talked about, the sort of, you know, those from a higher socioeconomic background in leadership positions, are you truly diverse? Or are they, you know, if they've all been educated at the same 7% of schools, is it that diverse? So I think for me, that's the kind of the reason behind it. And also, if you're measuring, then you can measure your impact. And that really will help you then drive opportunities for the future, for future interventions, and future opportunities of, you know, funding resource, or even just buy-in from senior leaders in terms of, look, this is you know, we've put this in place and this is how it's changed the makeup of our organisation, you know, for its benefit, etc. So I would say that, you know, for me, that's the main reason. I mean, you look at data in the training you offer. What do you cover in your training?
Yeah, for sure. Data always seems such a hot topic, and we talk about this a lot in the training that we offer to our mentors, and we can kind of categorize it, I guess, into two key points, I guess. So firstly, when you're thinking about data, it just gives you really great insight into who is actually getting into your organization, that initial entry piece. Who's applying for those jobs? So therefore, by proxy, you know, where is your outreach reaching? You know, which targets, which audiences are you speaking to? Who's essentially applying for those jobs? And then who's getting those jobs? You know, who's actually then being successful and are being people that are achieving those jobs in your industry? And when we're looking specifically at the creative industries, you are 2 times more likely to end up in the creative industries if you are from a more privileged background versus from a working class background. And then when we look at actually specific subsectors in that, the percentages are even higher. So in music, I think, no, in advertising and media, 6 out of 10 jobs are held by those who are from privileged backgrounds, and those who are from music, it's nearly 70%. So just by looking at that data, you can clearly see that there is a kind of, you know, there's an issue there in terms of who is getting in. And then also, you know, it's that continuation piece. It's not just about, okay, great, we're getting loads of people in through the door who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. That's kind of irrelevant and not impactful if you do have a revolving door at your organization. You know, if you're recruiting, but you're not actually retaining, and getting that data from your current employees is also super important. And tend to be, we'll talk about this in a moment, sometimes slightly more difficult. There needs to be a bit of a more of a kind of education piece around this. But if you're getting that data from your current employees, it shows you who's getting on. So, who's staying, who's being retained, who's progressing, who is holding those more senior positions. And, if you're then kind of collecting data on pay, you can determine and you can see whether you do have a class pay gap in your organization. So the creative industries, 41% of those from privileged backgrounds hold managerial roles versus just 29% from those who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So looking at that internal data allows you to see who's progressing. And we spoke about this quite a lot, Paula, before about, and I think you mentioned it there in terms of pay, knowing if you have a problem or not. And I read, for any of you who hasn't read the Class Ceiling by Sam Friedman, it's a fantastic book, 2019 or 2020. And I was reading through, and there was one kind of moment where I was like, oh my goodness, this is absolutely mental. And it was talking about in 2017 when the BBC released their annual report, and everyone was like, this is horrific. There is a huge gender pay gap here. We were looking at the salaries of Gary Lineker and Claire Baldwin, and everyone was really horrified at the real disparity between pay in terms of gender. So it was a real pivotal moment for the BBC. They kind of recognised that they hadn't had a gender pay gap issue. They denounced it. They committed to ending it by 2020. A huge scale audit was carried out, and they published all of this data, which is absolutely brilliant. I'm not at all saying that this isn't what they should be doing. But what was super interesting with that data was when they looked at it, it showed that 45% of the top earners at the BBC were privately educated, compared to, as you said earlier, that 7%. So actually what it showed was that the BBC was less representative of class than it was both gender and ethnicity. So it's just thinking about, if you don't have that data, how do you know if you've got any challenges there? And I think it's just about looking at it and recognising, and then being able to see, actually, do we need to plan some meaningful interventions about this? And Paula, we spoke about the kind of intersectionality earlier, so I'd love for you to be able to kind of talk a little bit more about that in terms of, and what that means, intersectionality between gender, class and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So whilst socioeconomic background is not a proxy for any of the other protected characteristics, all the research, exactly like you said, Sam Friedman, who was one of our commissioners in the previous commission, and the Bridge Group do some excellent research as well. All of it shows that there's a double disadvantage for people who have a protected characteristic and come from a lower socioeconomic background. And so things are compounded for them, really. And I mentioned our State of the Nation report, that we publish this annually every year, and there was one September 2023. And women are less likely than men to experience upward occupational mobility. So, for instance, only 8% of women moved from lower working class into a higher professional job, compared to 14% of men. So if you're looking at long range social mobility, there's a 6 percentage point difference between women and men. And people with a disability have a much lower likelihood of getting into a professional job from a working class background than someone who isn't from a working class background. And then people from minority ethnic backgrounds who are working class are more likely to have a better educational outcomes than white working class people. But these differences aren't replicated in occupational outcomes. And so therefore, when we're looking at socioeconomic background, you're bringing everybody into it and discussing everybody, rather than, looking at a diverse protected characteristic. It helps you look across the piece, really. So that's why I think that's important.
Agreed. Thank you. And of course, I mean, we've just spoken about the importance of it, what it can show us, who's getting in, who's getting on with the other class pay gap. But if it were that easy and that amazing and so beneficial, Paula, why isn't everyone doing it? Why isn't everyone in this room? And so I think we're going to discuss now some of, I guess, the challenges in collecting socioeconomic data. And I'll touch upon a few points, I think, and these are the most common bits of feedback that we get from people that we're working with and talking to. And the first one is, knowing the right questions to ask. There still is, as we kind of discussed at the beginning, that education piece of how do you determine someone's socioeconomic background, because it is complex and it is nuanced, but there is that really clear guidance from the ONS, which talks about the primary, the earner of the occupation of the primary earner. So that is there, but there is definitely still just a kind of education piece. And I know that the Social Mobility Commission, you have got a fantastic toolkit specifically for the creative industries, which we will share links with later, which really clearly just outlines the questions that you should be asking, and also then how to interpret them, how to compare them to kind of national benchmarks, and see maybe potentially where you've got any kind of areas for improvement. And a second thing that we actually often hear is that a lot of the organisations that we work with may not necessarily have a kind of formalised or designated HR department. So they don't have the kind of systems in place to be able to collect this, to be able to look at it, analyse it, sort it and store it. So they're those kind of like logistical, I guess, nuts and bolts things. But what are the kind of main challenges, I guess, that you see or that you hear in conversations, Paula, at the SMC around collecting socioeconomic data?
Yeah, so we get a lot of queries that come in. We're starting to collect, and these are the questions we're being asked, and quite often it's around people feel it's really invasive, I guess. I think we've talked a bit more about people saying, why does it matter what my parents did 30 years ago? You know, I've done this so far, and we do understand that. I guess one of the things we say, and I've heard a couple of membership organisations that are looking in particular for their members to start collecting it, talk about this, is 10 years ago, if you were asked to complete an application form and then it asked you your sexuality, you'd have been quite horrified, I think, but you're very used to it now. And so there is a piece around kind of we're just not used to being asked this question. So there's something in that as well. Organisations talk about it. We've done many masterclasses with various organisations who talk about it. It needs to be a comms campaign. It's not a data collection campaign. So you need to be very clear about why you're collecting it, who you're collecting it from, who's going to have access to see it, what's going to be done with that data. You know, make sure it follows all the GDPR requisites. One of the things, and I think someone mentioned it in the chat, said, you know, what do you do with this data when you've got it against that individual? That's not what you're collecting. You might have it on your HR system, collecting it next to the person so that you can understand their journey and, you know, map them to their progression within your organisation. But you're not progressing people because they have ticked that particular box. What you're doing is you're collecting it and anonymizing it and looking at it across the organization to see, you know, do you have a fair representation who are getting interested, as you say, getting in and then getting on, and what does it look like across the employee journey? So I think it's just making sure employees are aware that by providing this data, they're not, you know, it won't be used about an individual decision made for them. It will be used for the greater good of the organisation in terms of understanding the makeup of the organisation.
Yeah, completely. And it's that really key piece around bringing the staff on the journey with you in that education piece and really letting them know that, you know, we're going to recruit for a role, we're going to collect that data anonymously, we're going to look at it at the end, and we're going to assess whether we had a fair representation of socioeconomic backgrounds. If we don't, the next role that we think about, let's think about where we're hiring from. How can we make that more representative? So it's not, as you said, in that individual decision, it's thinking about longer term, how are we looking at recruitment, how are we looking at hiring, where are we recruiting from, and these are things that we'll talk about in our kind of next couple of slides. So thanks, Paula. So this is something that I could talk about all day, but obviously very biased, working for a charity that actively is trying to improve socioeconomic diversity, and I think it's some of the most interesting and kind of pertinent takeaways today for people who are in the room, but it's thinking about, you know, understanding the value of socioeconomic diversity and why you should be on board with this journey with us and why you should be kind of working towards it at your organisations. So, Paula, again, why should companies be including socioeconomic diversity in their conversations, in their DE&I strategies, in their kind of, you know, their organisations and the things that they're doing?
Again, my response to that, Tash, is actually why not? So, but I would say that, wouldn't I? So I think when you think about what we've discussed previously in terms of the double disadvantage, it can really support the opportunity to widen your pool of talent. There is a war on talent, as we know. And so a lot of organisations are thinking, well, where if we're just, for want of a better sort of metaphor, fishing in the same pool, but all of the organisations are fishing in the same pool, you're going to be very limited on who you can take on. And so that broader view and a broader representation of the communities you serve. So, be it whether it's the audiences or whether it's the advertising audiences or, whatever that looks like for your organisation, having a more diverse group of people and socioeconomic background, totally plays into that, can really help you kind of understand your organization's sort of, where you can go in terms of innovation and creativity. And I just think it's a great opportunity for you to widen that base.
Yeah, absolutely. It's thinking about like having that authentic voice, right? If you're trying to talk to those from low social backgrounds are about 40% of the UK population. If you're working in something like advertising, fashion, media, or marketing, do you have an organisation that's actually going to be able to authentically talk to that group? And that's a key thing that we talk about a lot in Creative Mentor Network on a kind of day-to-day. And you mentioned that, I guess we're linking back to that intersectionality piece again, which is it can, as you said, support other kind of diversity programs that you have within your organisation. So when we look specifically at our mentee community and the young people that we work with, 65% are women from global majority backgrounds. And, that is because we are targeting our eligibility is socioeconomic background in London, but it's also therefore improving a kind of representation of other forms of diversity. And this is something that Citibank, again, another one that we'll link after the end of this session, is that they did a really, really good report where they looked at the economic case for social mobility, and they looked at a case study with a law firm called Brown and Jacobson, and they actively took steps to improve accessibility for their roles to those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And they did a range of things. It's not just a one fix easy solution, but anonymizing applications, redesigning their careers website, making sure that all work experience was paid, targeting social mobility cold spots around the UK, and removing grade requirements and things like that. And the results for them were absolutely huge. When they kind of focused on socioeconomic backgrounds, they also then improved their ethnicity representation. So I think it was in 2021, 22 when this was in, 45% of their junior law intake were from global majority backgrounds compared to just 7% in 2016. So it's not, as you said, a kind of by proxy for, but it can really support other DE&I goals and initiatives that you have, and just hugely broaden that hiring and talent pool that you've got. There's a conversation we have a lot, is that we're really struggling to fill our roles. There's a skills gap, there's a shortage. How can we fill these? And it's that idea, if you're just recruiting from one small pool, of course you're going to face those challenges. It's widening that and broadening that, and as a result then having a much more kind of diverse output and diversity of creativity and thought. And yeah.
So it was quite interesting when I was a lead D&I at Santander, and we were looking at some of our intake in terms of our early years. And we had a member of staff who had grown up in care, had gone to Greenwich University, so not a Russell Group university, and had got a first in law. And she had applied to many law firms in terms of looking, for a role, and just wasn't getting accepted at all. And when you look at her as an individual, as an employer, why wouldn't you want her? Her resilience and her aptitude and her ability to strive for better outcomes for herself, and really her drive and her initiative, she would be a fantastic employee if you were looking just from a skills basis. So a lot of employers are now thinking about how you look at beyond the CV, I guess. And so what's the skills that you're looking for? As you mentioned, there's you're looking for that talent with those skills, and think about some of those things that people who may have been disadvantaged on free school meals, etc., may have had to overcome to get where they are. There's a statistic that shows that people entering education at 5 years old from a low socioeconomic background, disadvantaged background, so I think it's looking at free school meals, start 6 months behind their peers. But by the time they finish education, they're 18 months behind their peers in terms of educational attainment. And so there's a huge gap that then just compounds over the years. And so how can you support those people to have access within your organisation in a different way, but then also support them when they're in, so that they're there to, they're supported to succeed, really. And I think that's the key part of bringing different backgrounds into your organisation as well.
Paula, we've done it. We've run over time, so we're going to have to get to the really juicy stuff, which is those key actual takeaways for everyone who's in the room. So yeah, we've spoken about how we define it, how you collect it, the value of it. But I guess now what we want for you all to be able to take away some kind of tangible actions that you can implement in your organisations, so that you're bringing socioeconomic diversity in and it's lasting. And one of the key things that we've kind of spoken about throughout this is the word of retention, and this is a really key part of it. But Paula, I was going to do the stuff about data, but I'm going to skip over that because I think we want to get to the juicy stuff. So I'm just going to get stuck straight in and discuss, I guess, the 3 pillars, I guess, of the ways in which you can bring socioeconomic diversity into your organisation. So that first pillar that we speak about a lot is around getting interested. So it's thinking about, what can you as an organisation be doing to get people interested in your industry and what you're working in and what you're doing. So these things kind of fall under outreach schemes, visiting schools, shedding light on your industry. And this tends to be for those who are kind of younger, maybe not directly at that point in terms of them transitioning into employment. So what is your organisation doing then? How can you start that kind of outreach piece? But one thing that I do just want to really note on this is, when you are doing those outreach pieces, have intention behind it in terms of where you are doing them. So, like that previous case that we spoke about, like, are you targeting social mobility cold spots in the UK? Do you have kind of understanding of the demographics of the young people who are at that school or at that college and so forth? So informal outreach is brilliant, is a great way to do it, but have that kind of intent behind it to make sure that you are actually trying to therefore improve socioeconomic diversity. So that's that piece on kind of getting interested. We're going to mainly focus now just on the kind of getting on and getting in is the kind of chunkier parts of this. So Paula, apprenticeships are often seen as a way of really improving access and socioeconomic diversity, but what are the kind of key considerations and challenges that you kind of think should be considered with this?
Well, so traditionally social mobility has been seen as high academic achievement, and that's how you progress in life or whatever, getting good grades, going to university, securing high paid professional jobs. But that narrow definition really doesn't, really excludes many people who take what we would call non-traditional routes. So 50% of people who leave school do not go to university, whereas often we're told the stat the other way around, like 47% of people go to university. And with kind of that rise in tuition costs and just the not wanting to, I guess, in a way, and the student debt, it's important for young people to be able to look at various opportunities. And we did do some research on this actually in terms of outcomes for people. And some university degrees, the financial outcome does not outweigh, for you once you've graduated, doesn't necessarily outweigh what if you hadn't have done that degree. So we want to ensure that good jobs, good career opportunities are available for a number of people. And apprentices have been seen as that sort of that saviour part of it. But what we found is, since the introduction of the levy in 2017, a lot of apprenticeships are now moving to degree apprenticeships, and you're just swapping one from the other. Instead of getting the graduates in at the age of 21, 22, you're now getting in 18-year-olds who are then going on to do a degree. And actually, a lot of them are 25 now, and quite a number have already done a degree, and then the only way into an organisation is to get an apprenticeship because there isn't a graduate opportunity. So it's making sure you think about both routes in, but also different routes to apprenticeships. We know that quite a lot of young people from lower disadvantaged backgrounds, 21% of those are not in education, employment or training, whereas that's only around 10% for people from other backgrounds. And so there's a huge untapped potential of young people who are just not sort of engaging with the workforce or with adult education or young people education. So I think we want people to think about how they use apprenticeships, but not just degree apprenticeships. Think about level 2 to level 4 apprenticeships and what would be considered in the in the old days of almost trainee roles, and how can you support those. And we also know there's an issue for small businesses, and I know the creative industry is made up of a couple of really huge organisations and then a lot that are under 10 people. And we do know that the introduction of the levy has made it more complicated for small businesses to tap into apprenticeships. But there are some great organisations who are, donating their levy, for want of a better word, passing it on to other organisations, or they're people that are grouping together so that you're doing it as a conglomerate of people. So is there, could you look into working with others within the industry to take on apprenticeships? So we'd really, welcome people to look at those non-traditional routes into the organisation.
And on that, I think you don't need to reinvent the wheel. So work with organisations that are doing that outreach for you already, who specifically have the connections, who have those links to the schools, who have the links to the kind of colleges and so forth, and specifically who are supporting young people from low socioeconomic backgrounds. There are tons out there, and use those when you're kind of actively hiring for your job roles. Are you still using referral bonuses, and therefore you are just getting people who are kind of like people that are already in your organisation? Are you recruiting from the same recruiters? Can you really think wider and think about how can we kind of expand that reach and widen that net of the talent pools that we're accessing at the moment? Conscious of time, so we've spoken about getting in, but I think there is a huge piece, and I mentioned this earlier, is that it's not just about getting people in the door, it's making sure that people are getting on, and it's really about that retention piece, and that's a kind of bigger piece and something which requires you as an organisation to make kind of more system change with what you're doing, so that all of that amazing work that you do around your kind of getting interested and getting in isn't lost. So this is, I think, some of the main ways that we actually support those that we work with in the creative industries. It's really thinking about what's the system change that we can do. And the first one, a really kind of obvious one, is linked to your hiring practices. So thinking about when you are hiring, do you offer financial support if you are having in-person interviews? And this is super, super important, especially to those people who are applying for job roles who, if you are an organisation based in London, are having to travel from outside it. We know how London-centric the creative industries is, so let's help and break down that kind of geographic bias there and support with financial support for interviews. And thinking about, Paula, you mentioned that there about like different ways of recruiting, but the amount of times we read a job description, you're like, that's just definitely not necessary for that job role. And it's a historic job description that just gets rolled over and someone adds a little thing in, another thing in, and the next thing you know, you've got an entry-level role that's asking for so many different things. So really thinking about the actual requirements, like what are the skills requirements for that job role? Is a degree really necessary? Is 3 years experience really necessary? Or actually, is this something that you can really much kind of like learn on the job with some training that your organisation is supporting? So thinking about that, anonymizing CVs, removing institutions to kind of get rid of that cultural affinity bias. That's not a fix it, we do this and it solves all problems, because you need to then make sure you're seeing who's progressing to second stage, third stage, who's on your interviewing panel. Is it diverse? Is it representative? But there are lots of things that you as an organisation can do in terms of your hiring practices. So it's not just about getting interested in getting in, it's then actually about recruiting. And then, Paula, we've spoken about some other bigger pictures around kind of system change. What other things can organisations do to kind of really fundamentally change their culture, their processes, and the ways in which they're approaching socioeconomic diversity?
Yeah, so in our creative industries toolkit for employers, some of the research that we found is that some of the industry practices, are just not conducive to supporting people from a lower socioeconomic background. Pay is one of the things. In unpaid internships, love to ban them. And there's more organisations who are thinking about making sure that that's not. But I just want to sort of explain to people why, because I think sometimes people think, well, if we don't offer, if all other organisations are offering unpaid, we're financially out of pocket if we pay. But think about the financially out of pocket of that young person who might be coming in, who to get themselves through, if they've gone to get a degree, etc., to get them through university, they might be working in a local retailer or a hospitality firm, and they would have to give that job up and then go into an unpaid opportunity, and they might be contributing to the family household income. So really think about who you exclude by offering unpaid internships. Another thing is thinking about pay, living wage, as you've mentioned, all the in terms of supporting people up front in terms of for interview costs, etc. And that upfront bit is reimbursing them, but not reimbursing them before they've actually done it. So some people might not be able to afford the train ticket in advance. So think about that. But also, as an organisation, if you are, creative industries does a lot of launches, lots of events. Think about those people, those suppliers that you use, and ensure that they're paying the minimum wage, at least the living wage rather than the minimum wage, and that their staff aren't on 0-hour contracts. And that is also an issue for the industry. Freelancing, a huge amount of the. Double the amount of any other industry are freelancers. And quite often what you find are those projects, if we're talking about from a progression perspective, go to people or you've worked with before. And those projects are, the pay for that is 6 months after they've delivered the project. And therefore, people who don't have that family income to fall back on probably can't accept projects like that. So there's some of these industry that's a real challenge for the industry, I think, and the system change that needs to go behind that is quite a big thing, really. But it will help support those people to stay in the industry. So quite a lot of people are getting people in, but then how do you get them to stay? And so that's part of it, is really thinking about the systems change.
And on that point there, in terms of pay, I think this is a situation that we have when we speak to so many of our mentees in the organisations they're working at, and we've had being expected to pay for expenses on personal cards, and realising that actually can be super difficult for for some people. We actually had a mentee who had to expense cabs throughout COVID to get to an onset job, and it was coming up to about £400-500 a month. And she was, I'm going to have to leave because I cannot afford that alongside rent and so forth. So, people in here now, if you're working at an organisation, what is your company's expense policy? Do you have a company card whereby people can put this on? If you don't, how soon after the expense is it paid back? Just something quite small like that. Just sit and think about, do you have a really clear expenses policy? And if you do, is it inclusive? Could it be exclusionary? And the same with flexible working policies. Travel into the office is extortionate, in London and elsewhere. So thinking about if you are in the office all the time, or, what are the kind of cost implications for people in terms of that? Can you think about a flexible policy when you're doing your staff lunches? Is it really explicitly said from the beginning, you're paying for what you're ordering, and you splitting the bill? It's just having some kind of like clarity, and I think upfrontness about this, so that people don't go into these situations kind of feeling, instantly that they're going to kind of be at a detriment because of it.
Sorry, Tash. I think there's also a piece of understanding that people haven't been in the workplace previously, so they might not realise that if they're being invited to that drinks might be paid for by the organisation, or even if they're being invited out for a team lunch, they would be expected to pay for their team lunch. So think about other options. So quite often in the Social Mobility Commission, we have a canteen, but you can take your own food. So when we do team lunches, we go to the canteen because people can buy if they want to, but people can also bring in their own. And so therefore, you're not excluding anyone who might feel that financially they can't take part in some of these activities.
Yeah, exactly. So we've spoken about, I guess, CVs, policies, pays, but there are obviously other things that we can do in your organisations to create, I guess, that more organisational shift and that awareness and ultimately a culture that is more inclusive so that that recruitment is essentially being retained. And, you know, I'll put my hands up now and say I'm very biased because mentoring is what we do at Creative Mentor Network, but there is tons of research to show the kind of long-term impact that mentoring has in changing and shifting your organisation's kind of your organization's, you know, culture and making it more inclusive. So one of the main things that we would really recommend is formalizing mentoring programs or sponsorship programs. And particularly, we speak to a lot of our mentors and they all reference a mentor that they've had previously. When they first started in the industry, someone supported them and it all kind of happened, you know, just like organically, and someone just, you know, picks them out from the crowd. But there's something called homophily, which is essentially you are attracted, naturally gravitate towards people that remind you of you, that kind of are like yourself. And if we're thinking about that in the context of the creative industries, where we've got in some industries, you know, 60% of people in roles are from privileged backgrounds, what happens then to those people who are underrepresented in your organization and getting that informal sponsorship or informal mentoring? So think about having mentoring programs with a real intent and a real focus to ensure that it is something that's going to be supporting those who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and, of course, other underrepresented groups within the industry. So formalising mentoring and sponsorship key. And Paula, I actually learned something from you in our run through of this session that I'd love you to tell everyone about because this was super new to me. Would you tell the room about stretch projects in our final 3 minutes? I'm really sorry we've overrun.
So a stretch project or an assignment is something that you give to someone that's above their skill set or beyond their level of knowledge. And quite often what you see is these are informally given out in teams and they're given to the same people. You'll all recognise this from your own team, whether you've been given it or whether someone else is constantly given it. And quite often it's because they might think very similar to the leader. They might be the same as the leader who's giving it out in terms of their backgrounds. The leader might think that the team leader might think that person can deliver it the same way I would deliver it, and therefore I know they're in safe hands. I'm saying, and that just perpetrates that kind of just the same people getting on, really. So if you make sure that all of those kind of stretch projects are delivered across your team or are handed out to people across your team, when it comes to interview, when it comes to performance review, everybody's had a chance to do something that then takes them into their overperforming for their organisation. And you're not just giving it to the same people who can then talk about it in interview and then move on quickly. And so I think that's a really important thing to really be thinking about. And I think that's something that everyone on the call can take away and do in their own team, or even mention it to their own team leaders, you know, that you constantly hand that out. And I've recognised this. I worked with somebody who I was always given the stretch projects, and I think I know exactly why. And of course, you know, when it's happening to you, it feels like, you know, it feels great and I've got things to talk about. But, you know, I did have to point it out to them and say, I think there's other people in the team that should take some of these on. And so if you're also able to do that to help support your colleagues, that would also be a great thing as well.
Thanks, Paula. 11:59. That is our hour up. But I'm just conscious whether we move on. So I think probably what we will have to do, just because of, I think, Paula hard finishes, we're really sorry everyone for not getting onto that. We did say we thought this would happen, that we would definitely overrun, but there was a lot in there, I'm sure, and also a lot that I'm now looking at my notes that we didn't add in, just because there is so much support that we can offer and so much to talk about. So what we're going to do is we will send an email follow-up to everyone here with the recording of this session, with the slides, and also some just kind of core key takeaways in terms of links and resources and things that you can do. But of course, if anyone is interested in hearing in kind of learning more about socioeconomic diversity, improving it in your organisation, please do reach out to us at Creative Mentor Network. And of course, Paula, am I okay to send those people your way?
Yeah, of course.
So,
no,
I'd
love to hear from you. Yeah, definitely.
Inundate Paula's inbox with me saying everyone contact Paula. But yeah, we really want to support, and this is such an important topic and issue. And if anyone needs support or has any questions, we'll stay on for a little bit longer, but otherwise please do just ping us an email. And thank you all so much for being here. Thanks, everyone.